That means we do mark-to-market valuation when we have to look into the situation in the banks. Today, there is some change to that. There is a possibility not to do the exact mark-to-market valuation, but to do it like the Japanese did, not do mark-to-market valuation, not showing anything in a way. For 15 years, they had their crisis. So I would say, show it openly and transparent, do mark-to-market valuation. And you have to be very open and transparent in communication as well. If there was a referendum in the public whether we should support banks, the answer would be no. In Sweden, in Estonia, in the United States, everyone would say, no, of course not. Still, it's needed. But then you have to try to get some kind of legitimate support from people in the state, and thus very open and transparent also when it comes to communication. We had these three measures for different banks. We could give temporary guarantees to restore confidence if it was a bank with just temporary problems. We could give equity, or we could give guarantees for capital adequacy at a fee. And if we went in with equity, we wanted the same voting power at least for every amount we put into the bank. And that's what SEB learned. That's why they found the private solution later on. When we went into the banks, especially Gota Bank and Nordbanken, which is Nordea, as I said, we started asset management corporations. We took out bad loans because we thought that the management in the banks, they couldn't do both things, try to create a good surviving bank at the same time as they had to take care of all these bad loans. So we had the management, one Securum that was managed the bad assets for Nordbanken, and one Nordbanken which was managed on its own. And we capitalized these asset management corporations which with as much capital as was needed in order to, as we call it, crush the credits, in order to take in collateral to try to resell it in a good, as profitable way as possible for government. And we were fortunate. We got back quite a lot of the capital used initially in order to handle the situation. And we had legislation, very tough legislation, to limit this moral hazard problem. If you have a blanket guarantee, in this situation, you might have banks continuing doing the bad business. So you have to have that kind of legislation that if government can take over a bank if there's a problem. And we had another legal authority which we could go to and ask to be able to take over a bank if it didn't follow the legislation. Very tough legislation. By the way, the same legislation we have now once again in Sweden. The old 93 legislation was implemented once again in Sweden. So this is what we did. The cost of doing this was, of course, very high. I mean, I talked about a situation where you have to get confidence, guarantee all creditors and depositors. If you do that, you have to see to it that no one loses any money. And since the banks lost capital and they didn't have the possibility to repay to depositors or to creditors, we have to step in and capitalize. Altogether, 65 billion, 4 to 5% of GDP in Sweden, 4 to 5% of GDP. But these asset management corporations, already in 1997, they recovered almost 35 billion of this. So we were down to half, 2% of GDP. And there are some economists that did a study last year that said that ultimately, last year, after 15 years, we had a net gain of 154 million Swedish kronor. I don't believe that. I don't think we had a gain, totally gain. But we lost considerably less than we had to initially put into the banking sector, or rather not to the shareholders. And that, I must add that, nothing for the shareholders. They will lose everything if we have a problem. So this is how we handle the situation. And what conclusions you can have is, first of all, that government intervention, if you don't have a very single situation in one institution, but if you have a comprehensive problem in the sector as a whole, government intervention is unavoidable, however much you would like to stay out. Prompt action, to try to be not lagging behind, is essential. try to create broad political consensus. We had it with the Social Democrats that were in opposition at that time. We managed to do that. It was to some extent easier than the United States situation now, because we were just after an election. And the United States Congress, most of them were to be re-elected or not re-elected. So that's one of the reasons that the US Congress had their problems. You have to, of course, maintain liquidity. With our guarantee, with the guarantee the government put out for all the banks, the central bank, the Riksbank, could continue giving liquidity because all banks were solvent since they were guaranteed by government. Otherwise, the central bank couldn't have done it. As I said, open and transparent, tough on banks and shareholders, and you have to have an upside for taxpayers. You have to get money back later on by privatizing, by taking equity, having ownership shares and selling them later on. And we also besides getting most of the money back, we also managed to, due to the crisis, even if I think that John is right, you don't need a crisis to do reforms. You shouldn't need to do that anyway. In Sweden, it might be somewhat different, to be honest. Swedes don't like reforms. Swedes think that everything that has been there for years should always be there. No change, take it easy. But crisis gives Swedes a way of accepting reforms. And we had the pension reform, as Johnny talked about. We had budget law, new budget law with the expenditure ceilings, which have been very, very good. We started and finalized deregulation at the same time. We had a central bank that became independent. All these reforms helped us getting growth after the crisis, a growth rate that was better than in the Eurozone. So we, for instance, we are in a situation now, even with sluggish growth next and the year after, in 2010, our debt will be down from 80 to approximately 30% of GDP. So we have seen a very good situation after the crisis management. Finally, United States. I have been talking at some seminars in the United States, and I know that the Swedish example or Swedish handling of the crisis have been used in debates in the United States. Unfortunately, I would say I don't think that we did everything right, of course not, but I think that the United States has done a lot of things in the wrong way. First of all, I mean, you all have this case by case. You see our first savings and loans, Första Sparbanken. You see banks coming in and they have their initial problems and they do Bear Stearns and you handle case by case. Then suddenly you will have this crisis in the whole sector and the total loss of confidence. And you got it by letting Lehman's go as it went. Lehman's was too big to fail, obviously. It's easy to say it afterwards, I know that, but it was too big to fail. Okay, that's a mistake, but it's a mistake you might have to do anyway. But then they went in to say, okay, we are now going for a package to Congress, $700 billion in order to buy these assets that are toxic, as they said. These assets that had a nominal value of 100 and perhaps had a value of 30, 40, 50. Nobody knew because you couldn't look through them. And they said, okay, let's buy these assets. How do you do the pricing? Even if you do what they call reversed auctions, not to go into detail, you cannot pay the full nominal value. So even if you buy the toxic assets, you have a hole in the balance sheet. They still have a problem with equity in order to avoid the credit crunch in the real economy. And how do you deal with that? You need to do something else. Finally, after a lot of discussion and so on, the other day Hank Paulson said, oh, okay, we do the capital injection instead. We are not buying assets, we are doing capital injections. Then they handle the situation with the holes in balance sheets in banks. And that's the best thing to do as far as I see it. The problem is that, as far as I understand, they still don't want any voting rights. So they do it with an upside for the shareholders. And I think this will be very difficult with the electorate in the long run in the United States. You should have the upside, as I said. I will stay there. I mean, it's very nice always to listen to Johnny Munkhammar talking about reform. And as I said, I'm a market liberal who really enjoys seeing the example of Estonia, and the example will continue. I'm quite sure of that. I saw my role here today as trying to get more facts about how can you handle a financial crisis, and I hope that you got something out of that. Thank you.